On the bench I have some basic sharpening kits. A 1000 grit sharpening stone, a 6000 grit sharpening stone or polishing stone, and the Eclipse 36 honing guide. A honing guide will give you consistency in your sharpening. In this case we're going to be sharpening to 30 degrees, which is a good balance of toughness and cutting efficiency. 30mm, as in 30mm projection from the front face of the guide to the end of the chisel, will give you 30 degrees. Make sure when you are tightening up the screw on the side that you are holding the guide and not the handle. You can save time by making yourself a setup jig for your honing guide, which means you won't have to keep measuring with the ruler every single time. Japanese waterstones are very fast cutting but soft stones. They will start to go out the flat as soon as you start using them. So they need regular flattening. I am using an engineer's surface plate with a piece of 100 micron micro finishing film from Workshop Heaven stuck on top of it. You can use a sheet of normal glass, that will work just as well and is probably cheaper and easier to find. I've drawn lines across the stone, and as I wear away the surface of the stone on the abrasive, the pencil lines will disappear. Once the lines have gone entirely, then I can be fairly certain that the stone is pretty flat. Once I have flattened the front face of the stone, I give it a good clean down, and then what I'll do is I'll bevel the corners. You find that all kinds of debris gets embedded in the sharp corners or the arises, so if you give them a quick rub on the stone you can take them off, and then you reduce the chance of transferring that grit as scratches on the back of your blade. Before I get going with the 6000 grit stone, what I need to do is wash off all of the 1000 grit slurry. We don't want that contaminating the 6000 grit stone because we won't get as good a polish on the blade if we leave that stuff in there. So spray it with some water, wipe it down with a cloth, do your best to get all of that mud out of the surface so that we can be confident that we've got a good clean stone. So now I'm just going to go ahead and load the chisel into the honing guide. We are sharpening at 30 degrees. I just use the little setup jig and tighten it up with the screwdriver. So I'm going to start off with the 1000 grit stone. The 1000 grit stone has been living in a bath of water. If you don't have a bath of water to keep your stones in, then a 15-minute soak is all that's necessary to get the stone ready. Keep giving it a spritz of water though throughout the sharpening. That will help float the black particles of steel out the surface to stop it becoming clogged. So after the first few passes, have a look to see what kind of pattern you are putting across the end of the blade. You can see here on mine I've managed to, in a fairly short time, do most of the end of the blade, but the left hand side is still a bit shiny. So I'm going to keep going. I don't want to wear out my stone prematurely, so what I'm doing is working left to right, right to left, and then I flip the stone periodically so that I start to use the other end of it. That way I can reduce the amount of times I need to flatten the stone, because it's a mucky business and I don't have to do it more often than necessary. Spraying again with water. That black stuff is chisel, so that's what the water is floating out of the surface. So we're going to keep going until we have produced an even scratch pattern at the end of the chisel. So quick look. Now you can see the difference between this chisel now and when I just started. Now this is just a little word on making sure you are using the honing guide correctly. The wheel and the end of the chisel need to be in permanent contact with the stone. What we're trying to do is apply even pressure over the wheel and the end of the chisel, so that when you move it back and forth, it moves in a flat plane rather than rocking up and down like you can see in the video. What that does is it changes the 30-degree bevel to something much too steep. So I'm going to keep going now. What I'm trying to produce now is a wire edge on the flat side of the chisel. The wire edge alongside the visual clues on the bevel side will tell you whether or not you are really hitting the end of the blade or whether you are working somewhere further back up the bevel. So let's have a look. Right, I'm trying to catch the end of the chisel with my fingernail. So if there's a little drag, a little bit of resistance that goes all the way across, that will be the wire edge, and that's what we're trying to produce. If you haven't produced a wire edge, keep going until you do. Once you've done that, you can move onto the pink stone, which is the 6000 grit. I'm cleaning down my stone. I don't want to leave old bits of steel in there which will rust and may get stuck in the stone. And clean off the wheel at the back as well, so I don't transfer any of that 1000 grit onto the 6000 grit. So this is business as usual now. 6000 grit, you just keep going until you have polished out the scratches from the 1000 grit stone. So we're not doing anything new here. I'm still trying to maintain an even wear on the stone as much as possible. So I'm working right to left, left to right, and then flip the stone. I'm using a different cloth now, not the same cloth I used to wipe down the 1000 grit. Again, trying not to transfer coarse grit onto fine. Every now and again you'll find little bits of steel get stuck in the surface of the finer stones. So I'm using a little stone called a Nagura just to swipe across the surface, which will help unstick those bits of steel. The Nagura will also help produce a fine slurry, a slurry that is finer than the sharpening stone itself, which means that we'll end up with a finer and more highly polished end to the blade than we would do without using it. So I'm still using that even right to left, left to right technique. So wiping off all the debris, having a look, seeing how much of a shine I've got. And I hope you can see now that I've got a much more highly polished bevel than I had straight off of the 1000 grit stone. I'm going ahead now and removing the wire edge from the flat side of the chisel. The flat side of the chisel needs to stay flat at all times, so you really need to do your best here to try not to put a bevel on the back. If you have a bevel on the back, you'll find that paring and taking fine shavings is almost impossible, and you've lost all the advantages of having a flat back in that situation. The wire edge should come away fairly easily, so I'm putting quite a bit of pressure on the end of the blade while still trying to keep it broadly flat on the stone. Check, have a look. If you can't feel a wire edge, your thumb should just glide off the back. Then go ahead and finish off sharpening the chisel by stropping the bevel side. Stropping is just going to remove the last lingering traces of the wire edge. So you just draw it back towards you on the strop. The strop has a little bit of metal polish on it, so you'll get a slightly finer edge again than just straight off the stone. I'm testing the sharpness of my chisel on the end grain of a piece of hardwood. If it cuts it cleanly, it's done. If it doesn't cut it so cleanly, go back and start the process from the beginning. I know this will come as a shock to some of you, but the back of a chisel is not ready to sharpen straight out of the box. The factory grind needs to be removed, though if you don't do that you'll end up with lots of little scratches at the end of your chisel and your sharpening will basically be wasted. So you can see on the image on my phone that those lines are quite pronounced. So I'm starting off by rubbing the back of the chisel on a freshly flattened 1000 grit stone. You don't want to run the risk of deforming the back of the chisel, so flatten it first so that you don't accidentally put the belly on the back of the blade. So after my initial quick going over on the 1000 grit, you can see it's a bit hit and miss. There are bits where it's flat and bits where it isn't. It only really needs to be flat at the end of the chisel and at one point further back. So I am holding the blade flat on the stone, but I'm concentrating most of the pressure at the front third of the blade. So have another look in the light to see what kind of progress you're making, and then keep going. So this is after a few minutes work on the 1000 grit. I'm now switching to the 6000 grit and doing exactly the same thing, so putting a nice polish on the back of the blade. Notice how I push the blade away so that the cutting edge is off the stone when I remove it. Watch, there we go. If you drag it back across the stone, you might accidentally put a bevel on the back. So here we are. So this is what the back of your freshly prepared blade should look like. Then you can just go ahead and sharpen as normal. Let's have a quick compare under the microscope. So you can still see scratches, but they're quite fine. And now I'm going to finish sharpening in the usual way. So you should be getting familiar with the order of things by now. So 1000 grit, these narrow chisels, and in this case I think it's a 12mm, they sharpen up very quickly because there's very little to work on. So feeling for the wire edge on the back. Now onto the pink. Cleaning off the debris. Still trying to use an even stroke to keep the stone as flat as possible for as long as possible. Okay, time to remove the wire edge. So firm pressure, but keep that flat side flat on the stone. Feeling to see if the wire edge is gone, feeling to see if the wire edge has turned back on itself, as it can do. Now a quick strop on the bevel side. I'm trying to maintain an angle of about 30 degrees. And you don't need to do a lot of stropping, usually 1 or 2 passes is enough to get rid of any last lingering traces of the wire edge. And now I'm just checking on a piece of boxwood, the end grain, to see if it will cut cleanly, which it is. And there, quick look, so you can see a clean, crisp looking front and back. Damage to the end of the blade, like this large chip that, as you can see on my phone, can't be simply sharpened out. It would take too long. And in this next shot on my phone, you can see that there is a slight bevel on the flat side of the blade. Again, that would take way too long to take out using normal sharpening means, so we'd have to grind it. This shot is now showing you what the flat side should look like, with no bevel out to the very end. I'm using a water-cooled grinding machine to grind out the damage from the end of the blade. I'm going to set up the chisel so that the wheel will grind off all the damage, leaving us with a bevel around about 25 degrees. Just filling up some water, putting water in that trough. Now I'm using the angle setting device. The angle setting device is pointing at 25 degrees, and the angle made between the wheel and the flat side of the blade is reflected in that little shape on the right hand black pointer. So not that one, that one. So that the shape at the end of that pointer should coincide with the same shape made between the wheel and the back of the blade. 25 degrees is, well, there's nothing magic about it, it's just shallower than 30 degrees. So first we're going to do a little test, doing a little initial shaping of the blade. We want to see if it's grinding the end square or whether it's grinding a slight angle on it. So let's have a look. Now if you look a bit, if you can see that the back of the blade is not square, you can see several different facets. So I'm going to use the fine adjust on the tool holder to either skew the blade left or skew the blade right a little bit to bring it into squareness. Now keep the blade moving left and right. You don't want to wear a hollow down the centre of the wheel. Inspect it again. I'm checking with a square to see whether or not I do have a square end to my chisel or whether it's still angled over. If it's nice and square, I'm just going to carry on sharpening, or sorry, carry on grinding until it's done, until we've ground off all of the damage. So now you can see that I have only one single facet on the back, so just a flat or slightly curved bevel. I'm just inspecting it to make sure that everything looks right and that the damage is gone. You don't want your stone to sit in the water bath when you're finished, so drop the bath down to make sure that the stone is allowed to dry out evenly. If it dries out on the top whilst the bottom is still wet, you end up with a distorted wheel. When you've finished all your sharpening, wash down your area, wash down the stones, preferably under running water, and to protect your blades from rust, wipe on some camellia oil. Job done. If you've got any questions, email me info@furnitureschool.co.uk.